Well, if you just keep doing this, that we call all the shots, we do what we want, we don't listen, oh, that's a bluff, we're going to have a really bad accident. That's the problem.
This quote from Jeffrey Sachs is part of a scathing geopolitical analysis that claims that the goal of senior American strategists since the early 1990s has been not only to undermine the ideology of communism, but to weaken and disintegrate Russia itself as a continental power. Whether accurate or personal analysis, these statements point to several key and contentious issues in Western-Russian relations that go beyond the context.
Why does the West hate Russia?
You know, people have this capacity of delusion, rant, groupthink. But I'll tell you, I went back to take a look at the end of the Soviet Union in December 1991. Our defense secretary at the time, Dick Cheney, said, okay, they don't want communism anymore. Maybe Russia should be dismembered too. Why stop at the Soviet Union? The idea was already there. It wasn't about this communism or non-communism. It was about Russia. And so he was defense secretary. That started in 1992.
They also provide a source for explaining Russia's current historical roots of mistrust. From Moscow's perspective, the collapse of the Soviet Union was an imposed geopolitical defeat, not just an internal change. If ideas like the disintegration of Russia, attributed to Dick Cheney, or the Confederation Plan of Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, were indeed present in Washington's decision-making circles, then in the Kremlin's view, the Western threat to Russia's territorial integrity began immediately after the Cold War, not in the following decades. This makes Russia's strong reaction to NATO's expansion to the east and attempts to create spheres of influence all the more understandable. The persistence of a geopolitical paradigm, to quote Brzezinski, author of The Grand Chessboard, is key. His strategy was always based on preventing the emergence of a Eurasian hegemon, whether Soviet or Russian, by containing and building security barriers around it.
And in 1997, as I was reviewing yesterday, Zbig Brzezinski, in his Foreign Affairs article, A Strategy for Eurasia, says, yeah, Russia should be a decentralized country. There should be a European Russia, a Siberian Russia, a Far East Russia, as a kind of confederation.
Paradigm of deterring Russia from gaining power continued even after the elimination of communist ideology, proving that for some Western strategists, Russian power and expansion itself was considered an inherent threat. This view makes the current confrontation seem inevitable. On the impact on Russia's domestic narrative, such statements and documents have been the main fuel of the Russian government's propaganda narrative over the past 2 decades. Putin and the media have repeatedly emphasized that the West never accepted the weakened Russia of the 1990s as a partner, but rather intended to humiliate, weaken, and ultimately disintegrate it. Therefore, Russia's current aggressive foreign policy and militarism are seen in this narrative as a defensive and necessary response to prevent the implementation of those old plans. The discussion of capacity for illusion and groupthink, these concepts refer to the political psychology of decision-makers. Illusionary capacity could mean that after winning the Cold War, the West fell into the illusion of the end of history and having absolute power to redraw the geopolitical map of the world, including Russia. Groupthink could also refer to the thought bubble among some American elites who saw the ultimate solution to the Russia problem only in its fragmentation, without considering the spatial and historical realities and the devastating consequences of such an idea. This analysis opens a window into the depth of a strategic gap and deep distrust. Regardless of the accuracy of the exact statements attributed to individuals, The general spirit of this analysis suggests that to understand the current tensions, one must go back to the earliest years after the Cold War, when the victory of the West could have led to a cooperative security order, but old geopolitical fears and ambitions seem to have prevailed once again, sowing the seeds of future crises.
About this communism or non-communism, it was about Russia. And so he was defense secretary. That started in 1992. And in 1997, as I was reviewing yesterday, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his foreign affairs article, A Strategy for Eurasia, says, yeah, Russia should be a decentralized country. There should be a European Russia, a Siberian Russia, a Far East Russia, as a kind of confederation. What are we doing planning the dismemberment or the dissolution or the turn to a confederation of Russia?
This part of his speech is an angry and alarming extract from a geopolitical narrative that describes the policies of the West, especially the United States, towards Russia, not as a tactical error, but as a conscious, provocative, and catastrophic process. By setting the historical sequence of events from the Afghan War in the 1980s to the present, the analyst argues that the West's approach has always been based on structural weakening of Russia through various means. The phrase American arrogance is key to understanding this text. From the analyst's perspective, after the Cold War, Washington considered itself the absolute owner of the global order and claimed the right to unilaterally decide on security on Russia's borders, NATO expansion, missile deployment, support for regime change. This approach considered Moscow's warnings and red lines as bluffs. The analyst sees this not listening, not as inattention, but as a sign of arrogance that ultimately leads to crisis. Jeffrey Sachs, citing Brzezinski's role in luring the Soviets into the Afghan War, argues that the U.S. has a long history of using Islamic fundamentalism as a secret weapon against geopolitical rivals. This link reminds Russia today that the West has used every tool, even extremist forces, to undermine it, and that this pattern could be repeated on its borders, such as the Caucasus or Central Asia.
This is just blatant American arrogance, but extraordinarily dangerous. And it has played out now over 32 years with this NATO enlargement, with we don't hear Russia, with regime change operations, with the U.S. support for insurgencies along Russia's borders, also going back, by the way, to 1979, 1980, when President Jimmy Carter assigned the CIA to work with jihadists, Islamic fighters, to fight in Afghanistan, with Brzezinski's idea of entrapping the Soviet Union into a war in Afghanistan. And then that kind of jihadist activity became part of America's secret arsenal, extraordinarily dangerous, leaving in its wake wars and instability all across Russia's borderlands. And then the NATO push and the NATO enlargement and the coup in February 2014 and the placement of U.S. missiles near Russia's borders after unilaterally abandoning the anti-ballistic missile treaty and then unilaterally abandoning the intermediate nuclear force treaty under Trump.
He presents NATO expansion, the 2014 Ukrainian coup from Russia's perspective, the unilateral U.S. withdrawal from key arms control treaties, the anti-ballistic missile treaty and the intermediate-range nuclear forces treaty, and the deployment of offensive missiles close to Russian territory as links in a chain. Each move further undermines Russia's security and provokes a sharper response. The process has created an atmosphere of absolute distrust and a zero-sum game. The final sentence is a frightening and clear warning. In the current environment of nuclear weapons, armed forces on alert, and a lack of channels of trust. Any miscalculation, accidental conflict, or other provocation could lead to a catastrophic confrontation, perhaps even a major war. The analyst argues that this risk is a direct result of 3 decades of policies that have ignored Russia's security and left it feeling at a standstill. The statements are a voice of protest that accuses the West of putting the world on the brink of disaster by ignoring the deepest security fears of a nuclear superpower. This narrative is the main justification for Russia's aggressive actions since 2014, according to its supporters.